I so wish that I was there in person with all of you, missing out on that, but wonderful to be here in this way and to have the technology to bridge us together tonight. My name is Jessica Sandberg. I am the Dean of International Enrollment at Duke Kunshan University. And for those who are not familiar, Duke Kunshan is a partnership with Duke University located in China, though I am coming to you today from North Carolina, so I'm on the same late night time zone as Joanne and Peter are. My other title is I'm serving as the National Chair for NAFSA's International Enrollment Management Knowledge Community. And so collectively, I have about over 20 years, I think I counted this morning, over 20 years of experience working in international education. And I have experienced the community college environment, the large public university, small private, overseas campus, and now with a highly selective institution. So I've seen a variety of different models of financial aid and scholarship awarding processes, and looking forward to sharing some of that with you today. And I think I'll turn it over to Peter.
Good evening from Philadelphia, and good morning to those of you who are in Hyderabad this morning. And I will echo my colleague and say that it is a pleasure being on board with the IC3 presentation. I have had the pleasure of being a part of some of the regional IC3s in the past years. I've also had the pleasure of seeing Hyderabad changing from a traffic catastrophe, I would call it, to what is now a modern hyper city, which is just pretty cool. So I'm sad not to be there in person. I'm a former international student myself. I'm not going to say exactly when, but it was in the early 90s. So many of your students, I will be familiar to the situation that they were in. I then transitioned later in life to a career in higher education and have been doing this for, like Jessica, for approximately 20 years at a number of different institutions. Today, I serve as the Director of International Admission at Temple University, which is a large US institution, a global institution, and we hope to share a lot of information with you here today.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm Meenakshi Chatna. I am from the international team at the College Board. Based out of Delhi, I look after the entire South and Central Asian region. So very happy to see my friends from Sri Lanka out here today, besides, of course, the Indian counselors. So we always believe in College Board that the road to college should come with directions, and hence the collaborations with all you good people sitting here as well as online, and who would provide us with an opportunity to promote equity and excellence in education through the SAT suite of assessments or the AP program. Thank you. And over to you, Joanne.
Great. Can we have the slide up on the agenda? So you'll see today what we will be sharing with you, first and foremost, kicking off with terminology. There are lots of words that are very US-centric, I will say, that students and counselors and parents, as you navigate the college admission process, you may come upon as you look more into scholarships and aid. So we'll go through terminology, and then Meenakshi will share some College Board data to help set the landscape of where we are looking at in terms of what students prioritize when they look for financial aid, and the types of information that the data is helpful in setting expectations. And then we'll get into the meat of this session, where you'll hear examples from two schools, Jessica's and Peter's. They represent different types of schools in terms of how they assess and review admissions application, and how aid and scholarships are determined within that process. And then we'll talk about some other resources. As I mentioned earlier, NAFSA manages and helps administer the You Are Welcome Here scholarship that over 55 institutions participate in. And then we'll definitely have time for Q&A. So in the next slide, you're going to see two terms that many of you are no doubt really familiar with by now. But we want to talk about, need blind versus need aware. And again, when you hear the two examples of the institutions represented, you'll get a deeper understanding of what that actually means. So terminology and definition wise, in terms of need blind, it's an admission policy in which the institution, doesn't consider an applicant's financial situation when deciding on the admission of a student, right? So need blind. Whereas need aware is the admissions decision is made with the applicant's financial background in mind. So it's the opposite of the need blind, if you will. However, the big takeaway from this that we want you to be aware of is that it's not one institution or the other that has more funding available. It's just really institution based. It's not that one school has more, that's why they chose the need aware policy, or the other is more richer and so they are need blind. That is not true. That's just part of the policy, institutional policy and process and approach that they take to reviewing applications. And next slide, Peter is going to talk more about definitions.
Thank you, Joanne. And this particular area is obviously very important to myself, as I mentioned, as a former international student. So finding out where to find money or how to get access to money is really important. And it can be very complicated when you look at this. This slide that you see here, we have put the two things, or the two terms that you and your students should probably use when searching for funding at universities. One is the one that we normally say financial aid is sort of like the overarching art, but it's also very often defining the American side of the aid system for American students or US permanent residents. When we're talking about, for example, the FAFSA system in the US, which is only eligible for US citizen and residents. So those types of scholarships or financial aids, as you can see, they're usually FAFSAs, they're usually loans, they're sometimes grants, or they could be specific waivers that are either federal or state related. They tend not to be available for international students. However, scholarships in general by institutions can generally be categorized in 4 different areas that we have highlighted here. The first one and the most common one is merit. So that is essentially the student's academic progress or their academic submission, where the admission office reviews, and then according to what they read, they assign a scholarship. The scholarship that is assigned depends on each individual institutions. And as you probably already have heard numerous times at this conference, there are over 4,000 accredited institutions in the US. And we hate to say this, but there's a pretty good chance that there's 4,000 different answers on the way that we assign merit or calculations to the students who apply. But in general, it is primarily the academic performance, so the high school transcripts, sometimes test scores, or sometimes a combination. Then we have something that we classify as selective scholarships. Those are additional scholarships where students would submit a specific application. Maybe they have to do something, maybe they have to write an essay, maybe they have to send a link, a video or something, and then there's a committee that reviews that and then selects the winner of the scholarship. They tend to be more competitive than the traditional type of scholarships that are awarded through an academic process. We're actually going to present or talk a little bit about one of those selective type of scholarship later with the You're Welcome Here scholarship. Collegial awards is a third type. This is actually, some institutions will have their colleges or their school that will have award in addition. They tend to be awarded outside of the admission office. There will be maybe the dean and some of the faculty members that will select students to receive those. And then independently from the admission, they will select. The last one is talent, a talent that kind of says itself. Students who may have either athletic talents, music talents, or performing arts talents. If the university have it, they may have the ability to apply for that type of scholarships. And again, these, they tend to be outside of the admission scope. So the purpose of this slide really is to say that we have these four categories, and very often the responsibility of them lay in different areas. So when you and your students are looking for financial aid and scholarship at the institution, it is very important that you search various places at the institutional site. There's a lot more to say about these, and we hope to answer questions if there are specific questions to that. If I can have the next slide, then we'll talk a little bit about the financial literacy component. When you get a student admitted,
check one.
when you get a student admitted, they will very often get an I-20, and the I-20 have what we call an I-20 amount. This tends to be perceived as the cost of attending university for 1 year. So on the left side of the slide, you would see what this I-20 amount is. It's tuition, room and board, insurance, minus, for example, a scholarship or the financial aid that the student gets, and that is calculated as the I-20 amount, or the amount of money that the student will need to be able to support themselves per year. When we talk about financial literacy, we really want you to look at the right side. So that is that there are additional costs that your student needs to be aware of in addition to the I-20 cost. So in addition to what you see on the left, the tuition, room, board, insurance, personal cost, you need local transit, you need travel, you need all the kind of things that we take for granted, cell phones, subscriptions, beauty care treatments, things like that. That is not included in the I-20 amount. So very often you can probably add at least another maybe $2,000, $3,000, or $4,000 per year for personal things like travel and other personal items. I hope that helps understanding that when you talk with the student about cost and about the reality check, or really understanding what the full cost is, that there are additional expenses in addition to the I-20 amount. And actually, I think I'm handing it over to you now.
Can we change the slide, please? Yeah, thank you, Peter. That was very enlightening, and I'm sure all the counselors now know the difference between need-based and not need-based scholarships and financial aid that is available. So I read a very interesting comment somewhere that a student must have written. I wish college had coupons. Buy 1 semester, get 1 semester free. But I'm sure you all know that that doesn't happen and should not happen also. But what happens is the availability of financial aid, which is there in the institutions, and more students are increasingly getting aware about it through the good work of the counselors out here. So at College Board, because we have about 6,000 member associations and 7 million students that we cater to every year, so we also do a lot of work for the education community through research and advocacy. And all the slides, the data points that I would show you now are basically the annual surveys that we take with the international students. So as a context, although you all know, but just as a reminder, international students for us means any student residing out of the US and taking a high school program. So we do a lot of surveys with these international students who are a part of the College Board ecosystem in some or the other way, and they have taken part in the surveys. We also do a lot of surveys with the education institutions. Can I have the slide, please? The first one. Yeah. So if you see, these are the consistent factors that have evolved over the years, past few years, that have been remained consistent, that these are the factors that a student chooses to select an education institutions. So the first one is availability of the major field of study. And of course, we have prospects after graduation, we have personal safety, and cost and availability of financial aid. So if you see the slide, it clearly shows that over last 3 years, financial aid has risen. So this choice of students was into 2018 was 76%, and it's gone up to 92%. So 92% of international students really feel that this is one of the major factors that they would decide in when they would select an educational institution. Next slide, please. So let's see some of the average full-time undergrad total cost. And we all know that it is expensive, it pinches the pocket. It's an incredible cost for a parent to send a student for a US education. So if we see public 4-year out of state on campus, out of state means an international student. So this is about $44,000 per year that a student has to spend. This is for tuition, boarding and lodging. Then we have transportation, books and supplies, and we also have kept some header for other expenses. But over and above this also, I would say keep extra 10% buffer for other expenses that a student might incur when the student is there in the States. And if you see the private non-profit 4-year education, it goes up to $55,000 a year. So yeah, it is expensive, but the good news is that the financial aid is also increasingly available to the students. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in 2020, more than 1,000 US institutions have awarded over $2 billion as financial aid to international students, and this has increased from 835 institutions in 2018. And the latest data will be available on 1st October, because every year the data keeps on changing. The slide, please. I can't see. Right. So since 2018, the number of institutions awarding financial aid to international students has increased by over 21%, and we can see that 53% of the US institutions in some or the other way are giving financial aid to international students. Next slide, please. So we've come up with certain resources for international counselors that will be very beneficial for you all as well as your students to go through. The first one is a general database available for all the US institutions that are there, telling them about the financial aid which is available, how much did they give in the last years, and how much did the students take in the current year. So all that data is available on the website. And the next resource is the Big Future. I hope you guys can see the slide because okay, all right. So the next resource is the Big Future. It's a college career planning tool which is available to the students, and a very good tool because on one side, a student can search for all the institutes, the financial aid available, the programs, the fee structure, everything in a very detailed manner. And similarly, the institutes, they use it a lot because they engage with the students who are searching for that particular institute. So it's a very common tool available for the domestic. I would encourage our international students also to use it. There are certain scholarships available for using the tool as well, which are currently available only to the domestic US students, but we will, in the times to come, spread it out to the international students as well. The next slide, please. So this is one of the very important tools, the CSS profile, which is used by over 400 institutes, colleges, universities, and scholarship program providers in the US to provide financial aid to students who are looking for it. So generally, we encourage students to look for the university requirement when you're asking for financial aid. So all these 400 universities would ask the student to go through the CSS profile because in domestic, FAFSA cannot be taken up by international students, so they have to fill up the CSS profile. So it's basically an online application form. It asks for the student's parents' income, ITRs, assets, things, all financial documents related things, because it's a very comprehensive report that gives the institute an idea about the credibility or the financial stability of the student and whether they should award financial aid or not. So this is one profile that a student has to go through, but again, it is very comprehensive, like I said, so students should go at ease on this and not in a hurry to submit because only one correction is allowed, and that too only if you want to add some point to it. You want to delete some point, you want to edit some point, that is not allowed. And it's a paid service for international students at the moment. So for domestic, there are application fee waivers available. For international, coming 23-24 year, we would have certain codes given to the universities and they can pass it on to the international students. So then they would be applicable for getting a fee waiver too. But since as of now it is fee-based, so yeah, students should really look at it very carefully before pressing the submit button and sending it to the institute. And certain data points here for the CSS profile. So over the years, we have seen that the applicants have really increased. If we see overall international students also, they were under 18,000 in 2018. who filed up the CSS profile, but in 2022, they became over 35,000. So you can see the increase in the number of the students. India tops the chart in CSS profile, which is not a surprise to us, but China is in the 5th position, which is generally number 1 in the international student community. So even if I see Indian data, then over 2,000 applicants had filed CSS in 2018, but over 4,000 applicants have filed CSS in 2022 this year. So this is the kind of increase in the volumes that we are looking at financial aid, and why not? I mean, education loan is one of it, but if financial aid is available, why should one go into debt? We should avail financial aid then. So this was all about data and resources from College Board, but let's talk to the people who are in the university, who are giving financial aid to students, and what are the criteria, what are they looking at? So Jessica and Peter, welcome back. I would invite you for a panel discussion, and just to inform all the audience out here that after the discussion and couple of points from Joanne, we would also take questions from the audience, and please feel free to come up with them then. So Joanne and, Peter and Jessica, my first question would be, what is it that your institutes look at? So if you could briefly describe us the institution's approach to international student funding. Could we start with Jessica, please? Jessica, you're online.
The 2 samples that we've provided. So may pause and see that we have that up as a visual aid.
Can we have the slide, please? And we can't see Jessica. Yeah, we can see her now.
We don't see it on this end yet. There we go. One back, please. There we are. Thank you for your patience. Well, hi again, everyone. Now's the fun part, I think, where we really dive into things. And so hope that we can answer some questions that you might have. So at Duke Kunshan, I would say we pretty closely resemble University B. So we'll represent kind of the need-aware side of the equation today. I do want to make a quick disclaimer, though, to say that the awarding process and financial aid processes between Duke in North Carolina and Duke Kunshan in China are entirely separated. So we have a lot in common, but I wanted to make that distinction that for today's program, what I will speak about will be specific to the program in China. So looking at this slide, what many of you might notice immediately on University B is that the school is need aware. And Joanne did a good job of giving a quick definition for these terms, but I also recognize that students and perhaps counselors too can sometimes find that label need aware a little discouraging, because if you are a student, a talented student who needs a good amount of financial aid to go to a US university, you may think that this is not a good choice for you because you may not be admitted because you need that high level amount of aid. But what I hope that this University B template illustrates, and again, Duke Kunshan matches this very closely, is that sometimes these institutions that have need-aware policies have quite a generous amount of aid available. So like University B, Duke Kunshan offers both merit and need-based scholarships. The maximum award you can see goes up to 100% of tuition. So we have students that are not paying any tuition at all to attend Duke Kunshan. And beyond that, we have usually a few spots per year for students who need help beyond that. And so for those students, they're getting support with their airfare, their housing costs, their food, et cetera, and they're getting a full ride. We are offering, like University B, a very large percentage of our international students receive some kind of award, and that average award is very significant, as the example shows here, 65% of tuition. So sometimes I think what is the case with the need-aware schools, including the one that I represent, is that this large amount of funding, this generous funding, requires pretty careful control. And the second reason that for being need-aware is that in some institutions, and this is one other piece that you're going to want to investigate as you do research, is that institutions like the one I represent have a goal of meeting the full need of the students that we admit. And so in order to do that, to admit students and fully support them, there is an awareness that goes into the process so that we can balance the budget and bring in those talented students. So I know we're going to get into it further. I will pause there and turn it over to Peter.
Thanks, Jessica, and I hope that some of the terminology that you see on the screen are a reminder from the little circles that we had earlier on slide 4, and obviously the terminology that Joanne alluded to on slide 3. So University A, I am going to go out on the limb and say that the vast majority of public or state university probably falls into that category. And again, without repeating myself, there is obviously many different answers. But the important part about institution A in terms of the illustration here is institutions that are need blind. So basically, when we are in institutions like that, then you can submit the CSS form. You can tell us that you're very poor and you need a lot of money, but that doesn't play any role in the admission decision. The same way that if you're very wealthy, that is not used into the determination on the amount of scholarship or financial aid that you get. So there will not be any financial review in the actually review process. So that kind of creates, I'm not trying to suggest that University B is not a level playing field, but it's more of a sort of like a jungle over in University A where everybody can apply and then sort of roll the dice and then hope for the best. There are certain disadvantages to some extent in that type of university. Very often, the budget that we work on is probably more limited than that of the budgets available in the University B group. The other side is that very often is that we are not able to target a specific group of students to fill our class based on need awareness in terms of what the student need and what we can put in. We literally get the application, we review it, whether you need money or not. If you deserve a large scholarship and we have it, it will be awarded to you, whether you were able to finance it yourself. So to some extent, if we get in institution A, a lot of applicants of students who are full need-based student, and we don't have full need type scholarship, then we are really evaluating your application in vain because we do not have the capacity to meet your need. So that is really the downside of the work that we do. And I'm sure that I have many colleagues out here like myself who are, I don't want to use the term frustrated, but are saddened by the fact that we get a lot of applications from very talented students who we will never be able to see at our institution because their needs is much higher than we have the ability to provide. So I think that the word that I want to leave with the guidance counselor community is that when you talk with your students and help them understand what is the amount of money they can bring to the equation, what is their need in terms of scholarship to make that gap and make it real. And if that gap is larger than the available scholarship at any of our institutions, then they really need to apply for institutions that are able to close that gap better. I hope that makes sense. In terms of cost, I think Manisha, you made a point that at the end of the day, the cost is probably very similar, depending on the different types of adjustments.
Yeah, thank you, Peter and Jessica. So we all know that students fill up the application and they then apply for financial aid also. So I want to know from both Peter and Jessica that what is the coordination between the award selection committee and the admissions decision making committee? Are they both connected? Do they act at the same time, or is it the same committee? So if you could, let us know about it. Jessica, would you like to start first?
All right. I'll get started. So I think it is very important to understand the relationship between the evaluation of a student's financial need on one side and then the decision to admit that student on the other side, right? So we've dug into this a little bit and we'll dig a little bit further. So I think to put it as concisely as I can, representing the need aware position and representing Duke Kunshan, our goal is to admit the most talented students that we can afford to fully support, right? So that's sort of the need aware position that we have. The way that process happens is that students will first indicate that they intend to apply for financial aid. They indicate that on their application, and we use the common application. And then later by completing a CSS profile application, which is specifically for financial aid, as Meenakshi described. And then from the information we collect on the CSS profile, we're able to determine how much financial support that student would need to enroll at Duke Kunshan. And inevitably we have, as Peter was describing, inevitably we have students that have very high levels of need and students that have low or no levels of need. And because our funding, like everyone's budgets, has its limits, and because we do want to meet that full need of every student that we do admit, there's pretty stiff competition for those high level awards. We are selective in the first place. As I mentioned, I think this year we accepted about 15% of our applicants, so we're selective in general, but it's even more the case for those higher level awards. But again, if a student needs 100% support, we're not going to offer them 80%. So if they need that 100%, we've seen that. If we cannot offer them that amount, then we will not make an admissions offer. So that's the kind of the downside of the need aware process, right? Is that there's this selectivity that does happen around financial need. And there's that risk of not getting admitted for that reason. But on the other hand, there is a chance to be admitted and have a really clear and affordable path to enrollment. So I'll stop there and let Peter pick it up.
And that's a great point that Jessica make. On the institution A side, I would say that there's primarily two different ways for us to do this. Either we are looking at a specific thing, so maybe it's either academic only or it's test scores only, or we look at what is my personal favor. It's the holistic approach where we really look at all the items that are required in the application packets and maybe even supplementary documents to some extent. So in general, the holistic approach is the applications entry in the entirety. It is transcripts, it is various test scores, whether we're talking English scores, maybe SAT, ACT, or a test optional submission. It could be recommendation letters, it could be school statements, it could be portfolio if we're moving on to some of the creative arts or other things that the students have had. All of those are then considered as part of the review process, and a scholarship, a merit scholarship, is determined on the basis of that information. So when we go out and present at schools and we tell students or the counselors, please fill out everything on the application, even if it maybe seems, weird that what's interesting is in where I was born or whether my parents went to college or not. Well, some universities are going to have a scholarship specifically to students if they are first generation college students. So that could be important. Or if they're in a specific club or if they have participated in certain activity, that could be universities that are looking for that specific type of students in their review. So please encourage your students. If there's no field for things they want to say, there's always places where they can also submit a resume or something like that gives a little bit more details about their life. The other type of reviews would be some schools that say, well, you have to submit a test scores. If you get a certain score, you get a certain scholarship, or there's a selection of the top scores. Well, that's pretty straightforward in terms of what that means in terms of awarding. So I think I'm going to leave it there because there are many other different way of assessing that.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yes, there are many different ways, and we would get to that part as well. So, but before that, where do you think a student and a counselor should start when they start looking for financial aid? What is the first step, and how should they go ahead with it? Jessica?
Thank you, Meenakshi. And yeah, I know Peter and I are going to overlap on this question, so I'm glad I get to go first. But yeah, I'm excited to share a couple of tips that I think will be helpful, especially as is probably evident, there's quite a lot of complexity here. There's quite a lot of variety, as Peter described, and so I think it can be really overwhelming and daunting. And so I'll start with saying something that I think Peter mentioned earlier, which is, really starting with the student as a starting place to determine what the student is able and what they're willing to pay and their families, right? And so involving the parents and having those early conversations. Students don't know what the calculation is going to spit out necessarily when these assessments are performed, but I think it's easy enough to get an estimate at the early stage about what the student is likely going to need to afford higher education. And then the second, so I have 4 pieces of advice, so I'll keep them quick. So number 1 is determining the ability and willingness to pay. The second one is to get beyond the marketing language that all of our universities use, right, on our websites, and really try to get at the data. And so Meenakshi did you a great service today by showcasing some of that data, which is about international students, the amount of money that they're getting, the average reward, and so forth. This is a great way to find out where students are really landing. So when you pair this type of data with admissions data, like how selective a school is, the size, the location, and all of that, you can really start to put together a strong match for the students that you're working with. Number 3 is make sure the data that you have, and we touched on this earlier, but make sure the data that you have is specific to international applicants, because the easy to find data is actually going to be most of the time domestic for US students. Information like Peter described about loans, about FAFSA, most of the time won't be applicable to international applicants. So you want to make sure that you're getting the right data, asking questions, looking at the fine print, and then asking representatives those questions if the answers are not clear. And then my last point is to try to educate students about some of these fundamentals and empower them to form some of this research so that as they're communicating, that they're able to make an educated and informed opinion about whether or not this is going to be a good, suitable financial match for them. And I'll see if Peter has anything to add.
I don't think, for the honor of time, I don't think I will add anything other than just realizing that when it deals with the finances, understanding studying in the US or any other place in the world for that matter, it's a complex matter. When I described the understanding the gap between the reality right after we talked about financial literacy, that is, I think, is a very important conversation to have with students, especially if it is students of need that has a certain level of need. So I think I will stop here and we'll take the next questions.
Yeah, thank you. And like Jessica said, it is very important to actually see the data is valid for international students, because otherwise over the Google search and all, you get data which is generally applicable only to domestic students. So yeah, the tools that I showed initially, Big Future and other tools, that you can rely on them for the data. So Peter, you mentioned about transcripts and portfolios that a student should submit for getting financial aid. What is exactly the other features that you look for or your committee looks for when they want to award financial aid to students is what everybody, I think, has at the top of the mind. So if we could start with you, Peter, for that.
I mean, I think there are really a number of different answers to that. I have worked at an institution where for several years, the only thing that we used to determine scholarship was really test scores. And then I have worked at an institution where it was a little bit more, you had to write an essay. We looked at the GPA and that type of stuff. And then I'm currently and have previously also worked at an institution where we are taking a holistic approach. And by holistic, it really means all of the items that are on that requirement list. So, and one of them being the application itself. My school, which is in that university A bracket, at Temple, we are on the Common App, and I think there's about 1,000 universities that are on Common App. It's a very extensive application, lots of details, a lot of places for the students to fill in things where most of us, and I remember I was one of them who would be teasing students on Common App like, well, when you're looking at a really truly holistic approach or the opportunity to do that, that's a lot of information that a university can look at and dig into so that we can use other information than just the pure and simple academic detail. I will say, though, that everybody seems to agree, whether we like it or not, that the academic result of a student is by far the most important for the vast majority of institutions reviewing for both admission and scholarships.
Jessica.
So you want me to mention the documents as well. So there's everything, right? Recommendation data, transcripts, test scores, counselors, you counselors in the room, there's a section on the Common App, for example, and other applications where we want your input. We would like the informations on there that doesn't necessarily, we don't necessarily look for the ranking of students, but if we have some way of understanding comparably, so if we know that the 3.8 in the class is top 15, that is perfectly fine. You don't have to tell us the student is number 3 or number 5 if you don't use, but if you have a comparison graph, that's something that I like to see, especially when we have multiple applicants from the same school. But I think that's a whole different session.
Yeah, not much to add from my end. I think Peter covered it really well. The components, as he said, vary a little bit from institution to institution, but you can see those quite easily by looking at the application checklists and requirements. I think Peter made a good point about, completing the optional items. They're optional, but for students that are trying to compete for a scholarship, I think we all know that those are going to be important. And I also agree wholeheartedly that while the holistic review, which most institutions I have worked at participate in, it pulls in these other qualitative elements like an essay, sometimes an interview, certainly recommendation letters, extracurriculars, etc. But the academic achievement is still going to take up a big portion of that, the biggest spot. And so most of the time, as I've seen, scholarships are really allocated in a top-down fashion, looking at the students with the highest merit, however that was measured, right, with all those components, and then looking at it from a top-down form. I will add that in some institutions, and this is somewhat true for my own institution, merit scholarship is on the lighter side for us because we do have students coming in that are very high achieving across the board as a selected institution. And so the focus of our fund really is on eliminating those barriers with financial aid. So we tend to put the bulk of our funding there. So that can vary a little bit from institution to institution. And I think part of these targeted, challenging questions that you should be asking representatives.
Thank you. My takeaway would be a holistic approach, test scores, GPA, recommendations, and a very interesting concept called comparative ranking that Peter has just mentioned. So yeah, we could take away these things and inform our students about it. So back to you, Joanne, for taking us to the next segment, please.
Great, thank you so much. I hope that was very useful and informative. I learned things along the way also. We will have time for Q&A from the audience, virtual and in person as well. So I will go to the next slide and quickly go through some of the options that are available. We've talked big picture about financial aid and navigating, the types of aid and scholarships that are available. As I mentioned earlier, NAFSA, my organization, helps to manage and administer and promote mainly the You Are Welcome Here scholarship campaign. So a social media campaign that began after a tumultuous election in the US in 2016. Jessica, I will acknowledge you here and give you a big shout out. She's the founder of the You Are Welcome Here scholarship campaign at her previous institution. And it grew into a powerful campaign with and intentionality behind it, right? And so within the campaign, the social media campaign itself has over 400 schools participating and organizations. With our scholarship schools, these were the schools that were very committed to the goals and purpose of why they wanted to have, you know, welcoming and emphasizing a welcoming environment for international students. They wanted to strengthen the message that students are still welcome to the US, even in political strife and you know, whatever political situation we were in at that time, but also to create a globally recognized brand for a scholarship that specifically was available for international students and providing that access to higher education as we've talked about today. Next slide, please. You will see here over the years, in 2019 was when, as I mentioned, my organization took over administration of the program and the promotion of the program. I am very happy, even with a blip in 2020, we know what happened to the world in 2020, right? Schools still kept awarding scholarships. And then the increase, you will notice that we have more scholars for 2021, even though there were fewer schools participating. So we are on the uptick of the award and students coming back and being interested and receiving these awards. Next slide, please. This is just a map representation of all the students that are currently in the US on this You Are Welcome Here scholarship campaign, and you'll see that India is represented there as well. Next slide. I promise I won't take up much time. So you'll see here the student criteria for applying. All this is on the website that I shared earlier. The scholarship, the schools have to commit to at least 50% out of state tuition costs, excluding the fees that are associated with what the tuition fees are actually. So the tuition part of it, and then it's renewable for the duration of the program. So if it's an associate's degree, it's 2 years. If it's you know, a bachelor's degree, it's for 4 years. It is solely for undergraduate students only. So please make your students aware of this as you're talking to them. As I mentioned, there are over 50 institutions participating. Each institution and the applicant needs to meet the admission criteria of the individual institutions as well as their deadlines, but they also must complete a separate You Are Welcome Here application for the scholarship. And it's either they write an essay or do a video. So schools have their own choosing of how they want to assess this selective scholarship. Next slide, please. Some other alternatives and other considerations that students can look at. The idea behind this list and this slide here really is that students should look very broadly. And I think Peter and Jessica have talked about that you don't want to just look at an institution and on the surface see what's, you know, what is their merit scholarship or what is a need-based financial aid. For example, the philanthropy grants or private grants and foundation money or donations that institutions receive. Sometimes a rich family decides their child has had a wonderful experience on a particular campus or in a particular major within a department, and they are very specific. Let's say, for instance, the College of Business, an elderly couple, because they had such fond memories of their college, decides to endow their money to the college, and they specify it's only for international students from a certain country or international students in general. So those are all available, and you just have to dig and search and talk to admissions representatives and financial aid offices to discover those. They're not always openly publicized because they are selective and they're difficult sometimes to maneuver and find. So private scholarships are the same way, loans obviously, and campus jobs and internships obviously have some parameters around them for international students who are studying in the US. So we have 9 minutes left. I'm cognizant of the time, and I'm sure many of you have questions too. So I see a question here. Can some international students apply for scholarships or financial aid for his second year? I'll leave that to Peter and Jessica.
And before that, I would request the IC3 team if you could remove the slides and put them on the frame, please, so that people could see
Peter,
them
if you
as
want
well.
to take it, you're welcome.
Yeah, I'll take the answer real quick. There's really a lot of different answers to that. In usual, because scholarships are awarded by the admission office, then we are usually out of that equation the moment the students enrolled. Then some colleges might have awards. There might be a Dean's List scholar or something like that for students who are doing particularly well within a department. But usually, and again, I say usual because somebody's going to come and say afterwards that there are other cases, but usually the admission office has no say in scholarship after. I also want to say it's important the students study hard when they come, because very often merit scholarship has requirements that you have to have a 3.5 GPA or 3 something. And if you don't maintain that for a year, you might lose your $15,000 scholarship or $10,000 scholarship and will not be able to get it back. So that's a lot to lose if you don't study hard. Anyway, don't want to be negative.
Yeah, I would
Any
just add
questions
quickly
from the
that I
audience
think
here? Sorry.
that's.
Jessica, please go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry. It's the left-right thing is messing me up. Yeah, I was just going to add quickly that it is important, I think, to find out when given an award what the criteria are and whether or not it's renewable, as Peter described. Many awards will be, but that's an important thing for students to check on what are the conditions and so forth. And I also agree with Peter that in my experience, the vast majority of funding is going to come in with the student with their admissions offer, and that the funding that is typically available for undergraduates in later years will be smaller. It's also important for financial aid recipients to understand whether or not their financial aid is reassessed each year. Is their financial aid reassessed, or is that locked in and guaranteed? So these are some questions I think I would add to the list.
We had a question from the audience here. Can you pass on the mic, please, to her? Okay.
I guess I would be audible otherwise also. So you see, I represent an organization called ASDIA, which is the American School District Education Association. So we are just entering India and having collaborations with schools where the students get to do the 10th and 11th grade here and the 12th in US. Now this would mean that we would require this sort of a facility for the students. So would there be a possibility of having this sort of a facility for the students wanting to do the US board in USA? So I'm talking about, because most of this was on universities. I'm talking about school loads.
Okay. Joanne, would you like to reply?
And if I may add, if we were to start a process, how we could do that?
Joanne, would you like to reply?
I mean, actually, I'm not clear on the exact question in terms of what the gentleman is asking.
So if I understood correctly, what he's asking is that if the students are doing grade 10 and 11 here and 12 in the US, then what is the process for those kinds of students?
In other words, we're talking about schools, loan for the school students. We are generally talking about universities here. So I'm saying, is that facility can be made available?
Loans for the schools. Any idea about it, or we could
Loans for K-12 students?
Yes, for grade 12, yes.
Yeah, for grade 12.
No, I would include 10 and 11 also.
10, 11, and 12 for K-12 students.
Yeah, so I am not aware specifically of programs or institutions that offer these types of loans specifically for 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. Peter or Jessica, feel free to chime in.
I think it would.
That would have been great. I came as a high school student. I was none back in the 90s, to my knowledge. There was.
I mean, only through the school is what I'm aware of. Private schools might offer
schools,
scholarships or aid through the school
Yes.
itself, but not as an external organization that I know of.
All right, sorry. Any other question from the audience? Yeah, please.
So some of the schools have now made the test course optional after the pandemic. Will that in any way affect, like if a student has proper academic scores, but then they don't have test scores and they apply for financial aid, and there's another student with test scores, would that have a negative impact on the kid who is applying without the test scores because it was made optional?
I would say it would not have a negative impact on the kid who is not submitting the test score. But from the College Board side, we recently had a survey done. And 83% of the students said that we still want to submit the scores even if the universities are doing test optional because, as you know, in Asian countries, and especially in India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and all, everybody gets the same kind of a percentage. So everybody's like 95% and above. So how would the university see that which student is differentiated? So test score is a way that a university can differentiate. But of course, coming back to your question, it is not negative on that student, but it might be a positive add-on to a student who submits it. Anything to add from your side, Jessica, Peter, or Joanne?
I think you've said it quite well. I would agree.
We just have time for
From
one
our
question.
view is that
So-
completely test optional. There's no, we don't penalize anybody on the test optional side.
Correct. So anyone from the online, Joanne, if you have an online question too, we can take it.
There's a
We just have
question,
one
how
question.
and where students look for philanthropy grants or private non-government scholarships? Peter, do you have any recommendations?
That's probably the toughest question to say because I did a presentation once where I did a search for scholarships specifically in the US and came up with like 6 or 8 billion answers. So usually for institutions in our catalog or somewhere on the college school's website, there might be organization listed. Jessica was mentioning that they can be difficult to find, and that is true. But sometimes they're listed there. This is one of those where you do the search, you do the questions, and you have to do the footwork. For the private organizations that are maybe not related to the college, some institutions, some universities will have links on their financial aid website, and it's literally going to be a list, and it's going to be your job, well, the student's job, to go through this list and see which ones are applicable to them. That list is multiplied by, I would say, infinity, depending on where you're looking. So sorry, it's not an easy answer.
Yeah, it does require a lot of research. I would also suggest the Education USA office as a good place to start resource-wise. They would know where to point you to. And a caveat, please be aware of scams. Don't pay for anything to try to get a list or anything like that. Those are sort of fishy and not trustworthy. But I definitely would say start with your local Education USA office. They have resources there that can point you in the right direction. I think we are at time, Meenakshi.
Yes, we are. And can I request the IC3 team to get back the last slide so that the email addresses are there? Just in case anybody has any more questions, please feel free to connect with us and let us know how we can help you further.
And I see in the chat there's a question for Magna. I think maybe Jessica should be answering that one. I think that's probably proper for her.
Answer very quickly. The question is about, are family circumstances considered in the financial aid assessment, like taking care of grandparents or younger siblings that are that have a cost of study? And I would say loosely yes. Meenakshi can speak to the CSS profile. She's probably more familiar than I am, but the CSS profile application asks many questions to try to understand the family's financial picture and what their burdens are. Certainly other children that are studying and the cost of that education is definitely considered. I'm not 100% sure about grandparents, but again, there are places for students and their parents to include that information so that we can consider it. And oftentimes these are further conversations that happen once the student receives their financial aid package. If they feel something was missing, they can usually approach the financial aid team during the admissions process.
Keep in mind that's mostly institution B that will accept the CSS form or something like that, whereas institution A usually cannot look at a CSS form.
Thank you. Joanne, would you like to conclude, please?
Thanks, everyone. I think this was a great opportunity. I hope you learned a lot from our panel today, especially from Peter, Jessica, and Meenakshi for the wonderful information. As Meenakshi mentioned, please feel free to reach out to us through our emails. We'd be happy to refer you or respond to your questions. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time at IC3. Thank you so much.